Morena, I'm Danielle, the Strategic Impact Director at the Impact Collective.
Kia ora, I'm Steve Carey, I'm the Government Director here at the Impact Collective. Part of the conversation that we've been having across the Impact Collective lately has been around the way that we engage and the differences in the way that we do things versus what some of the traditional models are. And there's been quite a bit of feedback that I've had, be it at a national level, regional level, or local level, just around things like what's information versus intelligence, and what do we look at? The multiple cars up the driveway syndrome, the you only do it online or you only do it in a survey, and is that authentic, true community engagement?
We've definitely noticed that in terms of, getting buy-in and actually getting community organisations to want to be a part of our journey, that there's a lot of consultation fatigue out there in the communities. Organisations have been so generous with their time already. They've filled out these surveys, they've participated in workshops and sessions, and they've collaborated, and they've thought that they've had a voice and they've thought that they've been heard, but they've heard nothing. Or they've heard that something is happening, but it's now 2 or 3 years down the track. So that's actually been a huge challenge for us in re-engaging with these communities, is really, convincing them that we are actually going to create an outcome, and also that that outcome is not biased to our view of what we think it should be, and making it very clear that we only function in the information gathering and giving their stories a voice space. We're not there to kind of act at this point in time. It's all around kind of pulling it all together and giving that all a voice. So it's out there.
So we've always maintained the ethos within the Impact Collective of shifting from information towards community level intelligence. As we've gone through the process, we've always defined that we're not just here for big level metadata sets, which historically as organisations, as government, we've traditionally looked towards and gone, okay, so if we're just having a look at the data, what picture does that paint? And we've taken the step to go, well, actually, we need that lived experience narrative brought into what's been said. And if we reflect on the forebearers of where this has come from, we have the likes of the Ruapehu Wānau transformation team that did an evolving nature of this. We had the Waikato Wellbeing Project, we had the Southern Initiative, all different variations of a similar type. And it's interesting that despite that evolution of the way that they've engaged, it doesn't seem to be a huge amount of traction that's occurred outside of the kind of the 4 to 5 entities that are out there at the moment doing this. Do you think that the way that intelligence is now gathered and presented in terms of the reports is going to make significant change in the way that we do intelligence or information in the future?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because if you try and simplify it, and initially when we were setting up, we're like, it's the bringing together of the data, so the statistics, with the stories and the lived experiences of the community. But I think, we're on our 3rd profile now. We've done Wanganui, we've done Rangitikei, we're now in Ruapehu. And what we found is we're, kind of adapting and evolving our process as we go based on our learnings, is we really need to lead with the stories. We're actually really light on the statistics. They play a very small role, in the 4, 5, 6 months that we spend in each region. And we found that what's best is to bring them in at the start, use them as simple prompt statements. So the stats that do exist for a region that we think are interesting, we'll put them up as a single stat statement, present that in a workshop, and see what lived experiences that provokes for people. And that's all we do there. That's the first time we see the stats, but the stats don't actually get built in until 4 or 5 months back down the process, because that's where it's really important that the stories actually tell the stories. What we're figuring out, and as we move into our first round of analysis, and then there's validation, and we obviously do more analysis off the back end of that, is that yes, the stats paint a certain picture, and yes, there's a lot of data out there, but there's definitely limitations, there's definitely blind spots, and by leading with the stories and just using the stats as a starting point, I think that's where it differentiates kind of the intelligence that we're creating as opposed to information is where data doesn't exist, we're still identifying and giving those voices and those themes, which is multi-beneficial in terms of it's giving those opinions and those themes airtime, but it's also identifying spaces where data doesn't exist as opportunities for whomever to be like, well, actually, how can we get some data that aligns with these things, because they are real issues.
So if we take a look at what's traditionally been done in terms of information, a lot of the information gathering that's been done has been conducted by an entity. So, for example, by local council or by Statistics New Zealand or by MSD. One of the things that we've tried to remain is completely non-partisan in our approach, which means that actually as a charitable organisation, we have the ability to go in there and not have that burden of truth, which sometimes comes from some of the community responses that you get if you go on behalf of an organisation. So if we start thinking about some of the benefits of those lived experience conversations that you've had to have, by being that non-partisan approach, do you think that that has added benefit to the way that we're able to engage with our communities?
Yeah, it definitely has. It's embedded in our kaupapa and how we as a team present ourselves, that we want to create that safe space. We spend a lot of time up front leading up to the sessions, but also in the sessions themselves to ensure that everyone feel safe, they feel like they're being heard. If we've got multiple people in the workshops, making sure that we're including everyone. If we see someone being a bit silent, checking in with them, not forcing them to share their stories. We try and time box our workshops to 2 hours, but probably only about 10% of them actually finish within that time, because people get more and more comfortable as they go, and there's a lot that they want to share from their own personal experiences, but also from people they love and care about's experiences. Everyone we talk to, yes, they work for community organisations, but they're also members of their community, and many of them have been active members of those communities for 10, 20, 30 years. The sessions are intense. You know, we do get feedback that people are actually quite tired after the sessions, but I guess that being a good thing, because you know it's an opportunity for teams to come together and have a good vent. That seems to be a kind of, you know, phrase that people do use, like, gosh, that was just such a good vent. Like, we just really needed to have a vent about that, and you know, that can be perceived as something negative, but you know, from every negative there's a positive, because you're actually identifying an opportunity, and you're allowing someone to feel heard, and then you're also allowing them to be safe and sharing that, in terms of, you know, everything that we record is completely anonymised. It's not associated to an individual or an organisation. We say that up front, we get their consent, and I think that also means people are much more open with us. It can be a little bit tricky, because we, as a neutral agency or a neutral charity, we can hear a lot of criticism or negative feedback about entities or agencies in the area. The challenge for us is, as we move into analysis, is making sure that we can still capture that feedback and present it in a constructive manner without biasing it. It plays a huge role, I think, being that one step removed, and definitely, I think, leads to a completely different conversation as if we had, you know, someone like that in the room.
You've identified a couple of really important points there, actually, and the first one that you mentioned is giving them the opportunity as individuals to articulate in the facilitated workshops an organisational standpoint, but then you also afford them the opportunity to represent themselves as a member of the community themselves. And I guess the takeaway from that from me is, last week I did a thought leadership piece around ensuring that we're doing community engagement in an authentic manner, rather than just creating organisational hui's or interagency hui's. They can have an organisational hat. They are a member of that organisation, but actually you're wanting them to reflect on what it means to be a part of that community.
Yeah, exactly that, and that's exactly how we structure the workshops. Actually, we generally, as I said earlier, they're 2-hour sessions. And the first hour is all about their kaupapa, the mahi they're doing in their role at their organisation. You know, we want to understand what the needs in the community that they're trying to meet are, how that's going, what's going well, but also what's really challenging, who their partners are, the ecosystem they're working in. So that's really kind of focused in on, I guess, the kaupapa of that organisation. And then the second hour is where we say now, you know, for this part of the session, it's not to discard your role at organisation X or working for this community group or whatever it is, but we appreciate that you live in this community, you're a member of this community. So as we move through the statements, because this is where we introduce those prompts, we want you to share your lived experiences as a mother, as a parent of the local swimming club. You know, we want them to wear those multiple hats so that we can really kind of hear their experience in the community. Some of the feedback we get is, well, why are you only talking to organisations? You need to be talking to the individuals on the ground. But they are individuals on the ground as well. You know, everyone has a life outside of work, and many of the people we talk to through that, we identify they are doing so much for their communities, so much beyond their jobs, and there's a number of local heroes that we identify along the way for sure.
I mean, we're fortunate enough that our creative director can also get out and do some filming with some of those good mahi stories and reflect those through the community as well, which has been awesome to see.
Yeah, definitely.
And that all feeds back into the reports as well. So it's not just that we're going out and doing these facilitated workshops and just we feed that in. We feed in those one-on-one conversations. We feed in the podcasting. We feed in the good mahi stories and each of the other bits that kind of form part of that overall analysis.
Yeah, that's another cool part of it is obviously up front you can ask a community, like who's doing awesome work out there, like what are some really cool things that have happened, events, you know, are there any community gardens, you know, you can ask and people might rattle off a few initiatives or organisations, but we actually find that the majority of the good mahi stories that we are able to get Caleb to, you know, head out there and capture come through the workshops themselves, because that's where you hear about, you know, in some of the workshops we've been running in Ruapehu, you know, you hear about the local woman who's doing everything she can to keep sport going for the community, and she's just fighting that battle on her own, but she's not giving up and doing everything she can to get more funding. Or you hear about, you know, in Ruapehu, the vegetable stall that is actually feeding the majority of that community affordably, meaning that they don't have to spend so much money at supermarkets and whatnot because it is available. So we didn't hear about that stuff up front. We only heard about that stuff through the workshops. And then it's about kind of connecting and getting the right points of contact so that we can then go and delve deeper, which is where our creative director Caleb's really good in terms of his interviews. But also just giving some of these local heroes a voice and some airtime, because some of the stuff that's going on is awesome, and you know, stuff we haven't heard of, and the approaches and the answers are actually all out there. That's the thing. Like, none of this is new.
I mean, we've had the privilege of being able to listen to things like the Men's Shed and the building work that's going on at Wanganui City College, and the planting days up in Taihape, and Forge Boxing and Martin, and moving into the Ruapehu, we're starting to see some awesome good mahi stories coming out of there, such as Ruapehu Reap, for example, and it's just awesome to be able to demonstrate what's happening in those communities with the community voices, which sometimes we kind of lack as we're going through this. And I guess that ties in a little bit with what we're starting to see with the reports, is that each time that we're working through getting the reports compiled, we've tried to ensure that the voices of the community are reflected in there. So that if a member of the Rangatike picks up the Rangatike report, for example, they can see themselves in there, which has been a huge privilege for our team. But what it also does is it gives the ability back to those communities to pick up the report and be able to walk with it and say, hey, look, we know that there's some areas for opportunities here.
Yeah.
How as a community can we band together to do something about this?
I think you were with me for one of these examples. We were in Martin, about to present to the council, and
Coffee shop.
we walked into a coffee shop, and lo and behold, the new local librarian walked in with one of the reports with the curled over edges and post-it notes all through it, and she actually, I think she went up to you, didn't she?
Yeah.
And she said, "Are you this man?"
Celebrity.
Actually just recognised you from the report, but was like, I'm finding this so valuable, especially being new to the job, because it's giving her such a snapshot of the community.
Yeah.
I actually attended an interesting conversation, because I guess in kind of coming back to that consultation fatigue and engagement fatigue and communities feeling like there's never an outcome from all of this stuff. And, we do get it as well, because the reports there, a few councillors were speaking to me the other day, and they're like, but we just need it to be that step further. We want that priority list at the end. We want you to tell us what the top 5 things we need to focus on are. And it actually opened up an amazing conversation with everyone that was in the room, but it's kind of saying, well, no, because that's not our job. Like, our job isn't to say that, having a community hub in Martin is more important than upgrading the Taihape Town Hall, or, that's not for us to make that decision, nor do the insights or the stories that we hear give us any way of quantifying that.
No.
But it's actually around empowering communities and councils and organisations with so much more information than they've had before to work together to then action and make those decisions. It's an interesting one. And, I'm used to acting, you're used to acting, that's something we are finding, and, hopefully down the track we can activate more of a consultancy model where we can help to support the coming together of different organisations to start to ideate and act off some of these opportunities, but we'd be failing at our jobs if we did it for them. But we still come up against it. And some other feedback it wasn't really feedback, it was an observation sitting in another hui where we were presenting some of the insights. It was really interesting going around the room, because everyone had their copy and everyone had their post-its through, but it was almost as though people were only reading the bits relevant to them. So, people from Taihape, they were only looking for the bits on Taihape, and the people from Martin, they were only looking for the bits on Martin. It's like, but have you read the other bits? Have you noticed that actually Martin and Taihape are trying to do the same thing? So actually maybe you guys should start talking to each other, and rather than trying to do it in isolation.
Well, that's part of what we've tried to break down, is those organisational and territorial silos. So it's interesting to get that concept of actually don't take the report and then silo up again.
Yes.
It needs to be broken down, and that reflects that importance of the systems things. So whilst you open the bane of your existence, once you open up that document and there's a two-page spread, what it demonstrates, and we call it the spider diagram because it just goes off in this massive cobweb design, what it demonstrates is the importance of each individual element on what not only reflects a community, but also what reflects as an individual. And what we've found, and I've found particularly interesting, because the way that our framework's designed around the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the Treasury's Living Standards framework and what it comprises to be one, we've found it really interesting that quite often the things that are a significant strength are also a position of significant opportunity. So we're doing a lot in that area. But it almost appears to the community that, well, you need to be doing a lot more.
Yeah, definitely. And gosh, that spider diagram, I mean, I feel sorry for readers of the report when they get to that page. But, some feedback we've had is that it's actually really useful because, it captures all the themes and how they're all interlinked and what frameworks they tag against, etc., etc. By no means were we able to fit all. I think our poor designer when I passed it on to her, had to remove about 40% of it because everything is related.
Correct.
Everything is either positively impacted by or negatively impacted by, or has a positive impact on or a negative impact on another. And, you know, a really useful way that I heard the other day that people have been using it is they focus on, hey, this is the theme we're focusing on. It might be youth boredom and youth crime. But actually by focusing in on that theme and looking at where the arrows go, it's a very quick sense check to say, well, what's actually related to youth boredom? Oh, there's an arrow that points to, you know, technology and the influence of phones. Oh, there's actually another arrow that, you know, is pointing to the fact that, you know, community groups and organisations are dwindling because of COVID and, you know, that the elderly kind of not engaging as much and whatnot. And, oh, there's actually another arrow that's pointing to poor education outcomes and kids leaving school early. So suddenly it's trying to get people to just think a little bit broader. And for all of those interconnections, there's partners and there's an ecosystem of people that are also trying to address those things. So if they think about, well, these are things that are related to what we're trying to agree, automatically they've got a network of organisations and service providers that are actually working on something related as well. So,
well, that wider system, it's not just the system of the themes on a page, you're right, because most of those themes will have organisations or entities or community groups that are semi-related to each of them. And just by having a look at that and looking at where the diagram kind of flows and ebbs, you can see that you are part of that wider ecosystem. I think it's just really important for organisations to realise that any direct impact that you have positively or negatively will have an impact on something else within that wider ecosystem. Now, that's not to say that it's known or unknown at that point in time, but take an opportunity to look at that system and go, what is it, if I go along and create something that's around adult education, for example, what are the positive impacts that could have? It could have a higher success rate in NCEA, whatever the new fandangly education system
You're
is.
not that old, Steve.
Ancient. It'll be interesting to see what the downstream impacts of that actually are. Are we going to start seeing better educational attainment if we focus with adults, for example? If we start contemplating what that wider system looks like in terms of the interrelationship between the regions. Taihape has Taihape issues, we know that. Martin has their own, Bulls has their own, but it doesn't mean that they're completely unrelated.
No.
So what you've reflected is, hey, Taihape might choose to start looking at some of the opportunities, which may also be some of the opportunities that are required in Martin or Bulls, and how can you better map and collaborate and connect in that wider system to join up for success.
Definitely, and like a lot of these are national issues as well.
Oh yes.
I've always sort of giggled because, you know, especially when we're knee deep in analysis and, you know, as strategists, we think we've identified something really juicy and something really new that we haven't seen before. And quite often I'll watch 7 Sharp after the news.
And it's there.
And they do a segment quite often each night on, you know, an issue or a theme that's a national issue or theme. And then there it is on television. I'm like, oh, okay, it wasn't you. But, you know, immediately you kind of go, oh, well, then does that mean what we're doing isn't useful or it's nothing new? But actually it is, because it's just reinforcing that that's a real thing, and it's a real thing in that unique community.
Correct.
And this is how that community are getting impacted by that issue. It's like the majority of what we're unearthing and presenting in these reports, it's not new. Like, it's all stuff people know about. But I think it's also stuff that people avoid. People have no idea how to fix it. We quite often hear this around, you know, the increasing cost of living and the healthcare system and how broken it is, and people are just like, but I have no idea where to even start to fix that. You know, people are scared, so they avoid talking about it, whereas bringing these issues to the forefront in the report again is a reminder to the communities themselves that actually this is something we need to do something about, but it's also a reminder to all the big leaders that the report's getting pushed up to, that, hey, this is still here. This is a very real issue in your community, and it's not getting addressed. A big one we heard through the rangitike, and we are referencing rangitike quite a bit because it's the most recent one we've done, is elderly. They're down the priority list. Like, we literally are hearing that there are elderly dying in their beds because they can't get that hip replacement or that knee operation, and they're just living in agony. And they're getting deprioritised because they're older. And, we had some really passionate members of the community that are like, this is what's happening on the ground, but no one's listening. They can't even access some of the basic items they need to help support the aging process. Like, there's so many barriers even just for that. There's nowhere for them to go. They're ending up in these big empty homes that they can't look after because there's a lack of aged care facilities, and their families are forced to ship them out and send them away from their family and their support networks. So what does that mean? They just get more lonely. They and without going into a bit of a rabbit hole, it's like, this needs to be heard and this needs to be listened to. And it's scary. No one wants to talk about aging and dying, but actually we also identify a number of elderly that are loving life and have the support they need. So there is a better way.
Yep.
I guess, where do you start?
I guess, and that's the important thing, though. One step forward is still one step forward, but again, just reflecting on that system stuff, health isn't in isolation.
No.
So you've already gone along and you've mentioned a couple of things, but if people don't have access to quality education, then they don't have access to quality employment. If they don't have access to quality employment, they're not going to have access to quality housing. If they don't have access to quality housing, then their health and wellbeing is impacted on this. So the spectrum of how this all interrelates is still critically important. And dealing with one issue in isolation without thinking about, well, what's comprised of this. The biggest one on a national level that we're hearing about at the moment is this youth crime. We're starting to see it up in Auckland and Hamilton in particular with youth ram raids and all this kind of stuff, and they know that there's not a lot that can be done in terms of the criminal and justice system because they're considered to be youth. So what's leading to that? Are they in education? Curious. What's their access to quality kai? What's their access to quality housing? What's their access to a sustainable community and that sense of being in a community? So all of these things will impact on that, and then consequently down the line and later on in life. So I think if we start looking at, rather than just our little bit, how do we work collaboratively together as communities, going back to almost like a village mentality, making sure that nobody gets left behind, we're all going to be better off.
Yeah, and making sure that people read the full profile. They don't just read the bits relevant to them.
Yes.
I know people are time poor, but and I mean, that's another challenge for us, and why we're starting to do these thought leadership pieces and whatnot is accessibility wise, not everyone wants to read, you know, a big 300-page report. So, how do we start to, make some of this really important insight more accessible for communities? How do we target it to the people that need to hear it?
Yeah.
And it's all stuff, we're working on, but I think as much as it's our role, it's also the key leaders and the key people in communities really do need to read the profile so that they can start kind of pushing this stuff as well.
So given the topical conversation that we've had around across New Zealand at the moment around the census, what are some of the things that we need to have a bit of an understanding about? Death by surveys, death by PowerPoints, and is there benefit in getting that granular level data? My gut perspective on the census is that it's critical.
Oh, absolutely.
It's critical to the data that's presented. It's critical to understand how people are living.
Yeah.
And there seems to be this census reluctance, if I want to call it that. When I was up in the Waikato, I was speaking to a census officer up there, and they said people are nervous to say that they live in overcrowded housing because they fear that there's going to be some form of repercussion from the census. There's not. It's not like it's shared at that level with the likes of a social agency that may or may not have that power to make that so. But as a result of not reflecting that, we then have this skewed picture of how many people are in these areas and what the actual dynamic of deprivation is. And then how much funding should flow in under a normal business as usual model into these areas.
Yeah, I think first and foremost there is kind of that lack of awareness. Lack of awareness and how important and integral, as you say, this is. And I think we talked about it earlier on, like one of the biggest issues and why what we're doing is so important at the moment is there's so many gaps in the data. There's so many skews in the data. There's certain ethnicities that are so underrepresented. They can only, evolve it if people are participating. And if certain groups aren't engaging over and over and over, they almost don't know that group's there.
Correct.
Unless someone like the Impact Collective comes along and goes, oh, hello, like here's all these insights from this group that feels completely missed. Data's still relevant. It still matters. It still is the only real way that a number of the big government organisations and organisations across the country are able to build case studies, are able to measure impact. I wish we had a team of 1,000 strategists that were out capturing these lived experiences every day. But even what we do, we may speak to, say, 80 to 100 people per profile at this point in time, but that's not a whole community. Whereas, whilst it is a survey and we all hate surveys, that is the only real way to reach as many people at that granular level as possible. I don't know if this is a political thing to say, but, there's a lot of people that are tapped out, talked about engagement fatigue, just another survey, like...
What does it matter?
Or I'm just one person, I don't matter. I'm not going to make a difference, but if 40% of the population's thinking that, then how are the decision makers? And this is where I do understand, the ones that want that priority list from us. Like, they don't have time, despite wanting to get on the ground and listen to the stories and lived experiences, they don't have the time. And they have to make these big decisions based on intelligence or evidence or data that is produced and supplied to them. So if you're not part of that picture, then you can't really blame them for making a decision that may disadvantage or not include that group. So again, not something you can solve overnight, but definitely do intend to fill it out.
We've covered a lot today in terms of intelligence versus information. We've covered community engagement. We've covered the importance of acting and reacting in systems as opposed to in isolation, be that at a community level or wider regional levels. We've kind of had a brief conversation around the census. We had a brief conversation around the impacts of the report and how to take that. Where to next at the moment? I know that we're in the Ruapehu, and then, where to next for this?
For us?
Yeah.
It's a tricky one. I mean, as everyone we talk to relates, you can only do what you can do with the funding and the resource that you have. I do think that this is something that should be happening right across the country. It would be so awesome if there were teams, and it doesn't have to be the Impact Collective, just some entity, a neutral entity that is going around and collecting this stuff on an ongoing basis. I think for our team specifically, we want to get our 4 profiles complete. So we've got one more left for South Taranaki after we complete Ruapehu. But I think after that, it's going to get exciting because that's where it opens us up to actually re-engage, but do it in a slightly different way. And we've got lots of ideas as a team around, Is it that we focus more on actually activating and checking in around some of the opportunities that were identified, or is it that we go and talk to a whole lot of more people and see what's changed? I think what we can all admit is the country has been through a lot.
Yes.
In the last 3 years between COVID, national disasters, and everything. So the issues are getting worse, but I don't know if anyone's had the time to really breathe, implement and start to action some of these things. So I think that is really where our team locally in the Wanganui, Rangitikei, Ruapeo and South Taranaki region needs to focus on really bringing different organisations that we've identified through our research together, and shining the spotlight on some of these glowing opportunities. You know, we've got half the answers already that have been suggested by the community, so it's just kind of getting some focus and, you know, helping them, whether it's crowdsourcing or fundraising the money locally in their communities or getting funding through whatever funnels that they have, or escalating the issue nationally. I don't know, I'm starting to think we should tag in with census.
There'll be a lot of, I mean, our dashboard has the ability to draw on the census data, which has been really helpful. We all know that there was issues with the 2018 census data, and I guess it's highlighting the importance of that, because if we can't change some of the ways that these Crown agencies are engaging overnight, but if we're going down the lines of what's been spoken about through the Paeora Act and through the Public Services Act and through responses about what's needing to happen with Oranga Tamariki and other government entities which are saying, hey, we need to go back to the community and really authentically engage with them.
Yeah.
The reliance on data, as in quantitative data alone, hopefully will lessen, where we have this split of qualitative and quantitative sitting side by side, and actually the voices of the community has been represented in that.
Yeah, and I think the saying comes to mind, you know, like knowledge is power. People don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
So the more and the further we can push this information and, you know, getting it in the right hands, giving it, you know, airtime and whatnot, the better. It's easy to kind of just tunnel vision, if we want to call it that. And I think, understandably, it's been a really hard time. People are just trying to focus on their path and get through. But there's a lot of people out there that care astronomically about others and their communities and want to help and want to get involved in the action and want to support where they can. So, yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done.
Awesome. I think that kind of wraps up today.
Yeah.